If you were going to grow up and become anyone, you would want to grow up to become Victoria Miles. AM, not morning, as in Member for the Order of Australia, involved in conservation for literally decades. She's most importantly the chair of ALCA, but she's also the immediate past CEO of the Victorian Trust for Nature, where she spent 13 years. She's a director of the Yarra Valley Water Corporation. She doesn't just talk all the talk, though. She walks the walk. She even dances the dance because she's got her own covenanted property in Victoria as well. And now she's taking on her biggest challenge yet, which is managing the next panel. So Victoria, if you'd like to come up, and the speakers for Policy for Nature, if you pour yourself a glass of water to bring up and come up onto the stage, I'm going to hand over to Victoria and she's going to introduce the panel members. Remember to put your Q&As in as early as possible so Victoria has a chance to actually digest them and get them to the panel. Come up, Victoria. Now, let me make sure I've set this up for you. Yeah, come and sit. Sit on the end, that way you can eyeball everyone. Oh yeah, I've got a message for speakers, and some of you may be speakers here or upstairs. When you talk, don't use the microphone to point at things. Use the microphone to point at your mouth. So Radio 101, you want to go, well, that's a naughty symbol, isn't it? But that's basically the distance you want the microphone from your mouth. Oh, do we need another one? We do need another one. We need another two. I'm sure they're on the way. Victoria, take it away.
Thank you very much, Anne. And it's my pleasure to be facilitating this first plenary session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal people, and recognise any other people and families in connection with the lands here and with the ACT region. I recognise and respect the enduring relationship they have with their lands and water, and pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room today. So it is my pleasure to introduce the panel. The panel today is about policy for nature. How do we elevate policy for nature here in Australia? I think that we have heard this morning already that we understand the problem, we get the destination, and in my mind, and hopefully in the minds of our speakers, policy is a linchpin, because policy is very much about how we get there. Policy is what sets the framework, it's what takes those goals and makes them amenable to resourcing. Resourcing doesn't come from anywhere, no matter whether it's philanthropic, private, whether it's government. It is attached to policy. So the question for us really is how we get our policy and our legislation in sync with what we know the problem is and what we know the destination is. So, and I should also say that one of ALCA's key strategic pillars is ambitious policy and regulation. It is partly what we are here to do and what we're here to work on. So, our panel, Senator David Pocock, is the independent senator for the ACT Parliament and has been there since May 2022. David's done many different and high-profile things in his life to date, and you can read his bio note. Relevantly for this conference, he is a strong advocate for climate change, nature and biodiversity, and also intergenerational equity. Dr. Ken Henry is the chair of the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation, an inaugural board member of Accounting for Nature. He's held the position of Secretary of the Department of Treasury and Chair of the National Bank, Australia Bank. And recently he led a review of New South Wales Biodiversity Act, which again is going to be very relevant for us today, Biodiversity Conservation Act, I should say, and has done many other things. I encourage you to have a look at Dr. Ken Henry's bio note as well. Sheryl Hedges is the branch head of the First Nations Water Branch of the Federal Department's Water Policy Division. Sheryl is currently leading initiatives relating to better access to management and ownership of water for First Nations people in the Murray-Darling Basin and across Australia. She has extensive experience in First Nations intervention strategies and, let me say, many other things. So again, I encourage you to have a look at Sheryl's bio note. And Amanda McKenzie. Amanda is the CEO and co-founder of the Climate Council. She also co-founded the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. She served on renewable expert panels for Queensland and the Northern Territory governments. She's done many other things, and her work has been recognised over the years with many awards. So what a great panel to talk about policy for nature here in Australia. So I'd just like to lead off with a question for each of our panel, which is really to discover what has led them to work in this area. So I guess, David, what's brought you to recognising the importance and value of Australia's unique environment, and I guess led you to work in policy to try to drive outcomes that you think we need to achieve?
Sure. I grew up on a farm in Zimbabwe and loved nature. I was obsessed with birds. I wanted to be a game ranger when I grew up. And then Zimbabwe sort of fell apart. We were kicked off our farm. We moved to Australia. And I knew very little about Australia. I'd watched Flying Doctors and Skippy on TV. We're a few decades behind in Zimbabwe. But arrived here as a 14-year-old. I remember on the very first day, first morning in Australia, we were staying with friends in Redland Bay in Brisbane, and we went for a walk, and just the birds, where I lived in Zimbabwe, there was one parrot, the mayor's parrot, and I was obsessed with this bird. And here, just the variety of parrots and cockatoos, and it was mind-blowing. And we also saw koala the very first day, and I thought, well, gee, this is wildlife paradise. It must just be koalas everywhere. I think it was another decade till I saw another koala in the wild. And I guess it was a journey of learning about Australia's history when it comes to biodiversity, and just how terribly we're doing, and how the landscapes that we protect and enjoy are just devoid of all of these small mammals, these ecosystem engineers that are just so crucial. And I think sadly there's very little awareness of just how badly we're doing. And I think it was sort of a chance encounter with a quoll in Tasmania that, I don't know, really shifted something in me, and just so determined to try and ensure that we have that imagination to see what we could return the landscape to. There's no going back to, pre-European settlement, but we can do so much better. And we're going to have to, we have to ensure that these landscapes are as resilient as possible given the changes that we're coming. And so, yeah, I think for me, we're part of nature. If nature goes down, we're going down with it. And so I really see this as the big thing. Climate and biodiversity are the things that this generation will be judged on. And there's everything to gain there, but there's a lot to lose. So, yeah, I'm really grateful for the work that people in this building are doing.
Great, thank you very much. And Ken, we know that you've long been a conservationist. It'd be great to hear how that came about for you.
Well, yeah, okay, thanks. I was born on a farm as well. It was a dairy farm. It went broke because of a drought and, well, some other things, poor management as well, I guess. When I was very young, and my father went back to something that he first started doing when he left school at age 13, which is cutting down trees. He was a timber worker for just about all of his working life, cutting railway sleepers and logs out of forests up and down the coast of New South Wales. And I used to go out with him on the weekends when he was cutting railway sleepers and observe what was going on and wonder what the hell was happening and why this was allowed to happen. And when I asked him, he couldn't understand it either, but it's something that he knew how to do. He didn't think it was smart. He didn't think that this is how we should be managing our forests, but nevertheless, nobody was listening to his views. And He continued to chop down trees for, I think, about 50 years of his life. He was also one of the founders of the local Surf Life Saving Club, and I got the opportunity to see what sand mining does to beaches and to the wetlands behind beaches at a very young age. So at a very young age, I observed the destruction of nature in many forms. Acid sulphate soils created on dairy properties where farmers thought that all you had to do was drain a swamp and put some cows on it, and those places have been devoid of productivity and wildlife for as long as longer than I've been alive. When I remember a little while ago when I did an interview with Richard Feidler on the Conversations program, and he asked me a question I'd never really thought about before, and he said, "Did you start studying economics in order to understand how the world operates?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I did. I mean, I think that is what drew me to economics, was trying to understand why things happen in the way that they happen." But I also know that the reason that I joined the public service was to change the way that things happen. The first 40 years haven't really been terribly successful, not with respect to impact on environmental outcomes, but things are changing. Things have changed a hell of a lot, actually, and it does seem to me that there's an extraordinary opportunity right now, unique in my lifetime. It may well be unique for humans on this planet, where I see the possibility to achieve some great things, but it is going to require very substantial policy change, and that's what we can talk about here this morning.
Great, thanks Ken. And Sheryl, if you can tell us a little bit about what's led you to work specifically in this space in the department.
Thank you. Wallawani. I'm a Wabunja woman, which is from the south coast of New South Wales, so I've always grown up and been taught by my parents, my mother, my grandmother, my aunties and uncles about caring for country. Country for us is land, water, sky, spirit, and so I've always had an interest in that. In my younger days, used to get in trouble with the police a lot, so I grew up to become a police officer. After the police, I joined the public service and have primarily been working within the environment field. And that's really important for me because I can try and influence and bring a First Nations perspective to what we want to try and achieve for the environment and for our country. And I work very strongly with Mob Outside so that together we can bring this holistic perspective, I guess, on how we can empower, how we can put management, ownership, decision-making into First Nations people's hands. So primarily I always come from a First Nations perspective, but when I have my Gubba hat on, of course I have to follow the APS requirements and everything, and hopefully influence some of our politicians and others to support better outcomes for Mob. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Amanda, I know you've worked very much in the climate change area. Just wondering if you've got any reflections about your connection also with nature and the nature crisis that we've got upon us.
Absolutely. So as a child, my father in particular took us on lots of hiking trips, camping. We'd go on family road trips around Australia to lots of our beautiful natural places. And my dad is a scientist by training, and I would ask relentless questions about how the world worked. And I was just really fascinated by the natural world. But like Ken had mentioned, with an experience of seeing destruction, seeing logging in Victoria just seemed so crazy to me as a child, as we'd be going to these different places and we'd go past logging coups, and particularly that Clearfield logging, asking my dad, where are all the animals going to go? Where are all the birds going to go? And so I was very motivated to work in environment and social justice. And so I went down the pathway of studying to be a scientist, but quickly found that long periods in the lab was not really for me, so shifted to studying politics and law. I then was hiking in Tasmania, and I'd picked up a book, Tim Flannery's The Weather Makers, in the airport, not really thinking much about it, had a vague sort of understanding of climate change. But I read that book while we were in the Styx Valley, and if you know that forest, you look up and 75 metres above you are these beautiful trees that are some of the tallest in the world, there before Europeans even knew Australia existed. And in that ancient forest, I was just struck by this intense juxtaposition of here is this ancient wilderness that has been there for so long versus what I'm reading about, how we can fundamentally change the climate in a generation, which would cause so much destruction to nature and so much suffering to creatures, including human beings all around the world. So I then became incredibly motivated to work on climate change. Initially I thought once everyone knew how bad it was that we'd certainly be acting and those graphs that we saw earlier would not be happening. But obviously change is a little bit harder than that. So here I am sort of 20 years down the track from that initial period in the Styx Valley.
Okay, well, I think it's been really great to hear how each of you came to be here, because you've all contributed and are contributing so significantly to this policy area. So I'd like to dig in a little bit more to how we can be doing policy here. As I said, I think we know the problem, we know a lot of the solutions, we know they're multifarious solutions, but how do we get this policy happening so it can actually start to leverage some of the changes and resources? Now, David, I think you've got a really well-known reputation for championing causes in the Senate, and just wondering if you can tell us what political and policy arguments seem to be gaining traction for nature conservation where you are, and what is likely to work with your political colleagues?
It's certainly been eye-opening in there, and I think when it comes to the environment, it's pretty grim, where we have major parties who are willing to do the bare minimum and to try and package it up as we're spending more than we ever have, but we know that that's not enough. And so I think, firstly, we need more public awareness to be pushing representatives to actually act in line with what the community wants, because we know that Australians love nature. We love our wild places, the places that people go and hike, spend time in nature, go on holiday. We need politicians to actually prioritise that. I think some of the things that we are seeing some interest from Labor on are things like TNFDs, actually disclosing nature-related risks. In the ag side of things, there is appetite when it comes to invasive species. So I think there's a few different areas we continue to push, but I would just love to see more ambition from the major parties on this, rather than, I guess, just what we're seeing, where we know how bad it is. We have these big announcements about halting extinction, but we're just seeing nowhere near enough funding and boots on the ground to actually deliver on those ambitious promises.
Okay, so that's I think that's really helpful and instructive for all of us in this room. I mean, you're certainly saying there's a lot more work for us to do in the challenge in this policy space and awareness raising to get there, because you're not letting us know what key things are working in the Senate at the moment.
Well, I think at the making it, the thing we saw with climate was that until you're actually connected to people's lives, and politicians, this is maybe a bit cynical, but politicians see that it's something that people are going to actually vote on, then we maybe don't see the change that we need to see in the time frame that we need to see that change in. So I think there is a sort of public awareness and really driving home just how critical this is. This is not a nice to have. This is fundamental to our existence. Standing up for nature and fighting for nature is standing up for yourself. And I think one of the challenges in Australia is that you can't love something that you don't know, and you're not going to fight for something you don't love. We've got to get more people knowing about how incredible biodiversity is in Australia and what it means, so that we can see people loving it and actually fighting for it.
Ken, obviously you spent a lot of time in the public sector. Just wondering if, before we talk a bit more about the recent review that you led, if you could just provide some reflections or thoughts on how policy itself, policy settings, can change the trajectory of outcomes for us. What is the role of policy in your experience?
Yeah. It's a truism, or at least it was considered a truism when I joined the public service, that a government that presided over a recession would necessarily lose the next election. If it didn't lose the next election, it would be booted out of office shortly thereafter. There's nothing similar in the environment space. That's kind of bizarre, right? I mean, that's weird. But the reason there's not is because, firstly, governments don't set targets with respect to the environment, at least not near-term targets. And secondly, we in the community don't hold them accountable for the achievement of those targets. As David said, policies directed toward improving environmental outcomes tend to be regarded as a bit of a nice to have. It's an optional extra. And if you think about the whole ecologically sustainable development system that was meant to hold governments and also corporates to account for what they were doing to the environment, you see the same thinking, that the environment was something that you might want to pay a bit of attention to, but nevertheless, one could and should be prepared to trade off environmental damage against increased incomes, that is economic benefit, and also social benefit. That's not how ESD was originally conceived. It was conceived in order to say, hey, guess what? Economic and social progress is subject to ecological constraints that really have to be understood and have to be respected. But that's not how it's been implemented in practice. Rather, the environment is just something that could be traded off against economic improvement and social improvement. I think we've got to a point now where people all over the world understand that that hasn't worked, and that's where the push for nature positive has come from. So what we need governments to do now is to embrace targets that, as Marco said earlier, targets that can be understood by the community in general, and targets that are fairly easily measurable, and targets that we, the community, can hold governments to account for the achievement of, and in the ballot box, punish them when they don't achieve those targets, as we do punish them when they don't achieve economic targets and to some extent also social targets. I think that's a really, really important point. What goes with it, of course, is transparency, understanding exactly what is happening with the information being reported to the community in the same way that economic statistics are reported to the community. It's just extraordinary how much we in Australia spend producing statistics under the system of national accounts, and compare that with how little, the piddling amounts that we spend as a nation in reporting environmental statistics. It's absolutely ridiculous. And then the third thing we need to do is to develop policies that change prices so that businesses respond to changes in prices that reflect environmental damage of their activities. Those are the three things I think we need. Well, there's a lot more, but those three things would be a hell of a good start.
I think while just to ask a follow-up question on that, in your recent review of the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Act, I think one of the things that you said is that nature laws need to have primacy. They need to not be subject to continual carve-outs and the trade-offs and balancings that you've just been talking about. I was wondering if you could explain that again for us. What would it look like for nature laws and nature policy to have that primacy?
Yeah. So when we were undertaking the review, look, it was a bit of a shock to me. Honestly, I had paid some attention to the New South Wales legislation when it was going through the New South Wales Parliament some years previously, but obviously I hadn't paid sufficient attention. And so I read the objects of the Act. They're really impressive. And when I started talking to public servants in New South Wales about how the Act was being applied in practice, what I kept hearing was, oh, yeah, but actually there's this competing legislation over there that provides a carve-out. So actually the Biodiversity Conservation Act doesn't apply in those cases. I mean, obviously, for example, it doesn't apply with respect to New South Wales forestry. I mean, for heaven's sake. So there are carve-outs all over the place. And so it didn't take long to come to the conclusion that the objects of the Act, not only were they not being realised in New South Wales, but they could not possibly be realised because of all the carve-outs in competing pieces of legislation, not complementary pieces of legislation, competing pieces of legislation. And so that if one wanted to achieve the environmental outcomes, one had to come up with a legislative framework that gave primacy to the environmental goals. So the challenge now for the New South Wales Government, assuming they want to accept those recommendations, is to decide on a whole-of-government basis, and it obviously has to be whole-of-government, what the environment targets are. That is, if they're going to embrace nature positive, as other governments have, what are the targets that they're going to hold themselves accountable to the delivery of, and then decide how they can structure the legislative framework in order that these competing pieces of legislation are not competing, but rather complementary, and help the Biodiversity Conservation Act deliver those targets that the government as a whole holds itself accountable for the delivery of. Not just the Environment Minister, as impressive as she is, but the government as a whole holds itself accountable for the achievement of those environmental outcomes.
Thank you. Now, Amanda, I mean, it seems that people, our community, the world as a whole, has understood really that climate change is upon us. The nature crisis has probably not cemented itself in people's consciousness in the same sort of way, and I think we've heard that from, I mean, we all know that, and that's also what our speakers have been saying. What do you think the nature crisis, if I can put it like that, can learn? What political lessons are there and policy lessons from how it's been approached for climate change? What can we learn from the trajectory, if you like, of the climate change debate and understanding of that issue?
So the way that I think about changing a public narrative is that that narrative defines the operating environment for politicians. So some of the things that Ken was saying we need politicians to do, they will only do it if they feel like it is going to be beneficial for them and if they can get elected again. And that's, you know, reasonable, I think. So that operating window or operating environment, we need to be changing always in the direction that is useful for us. So opening space at the top end and closing space on the other end on narratives that are not useful for us. So if that's the starting point, how do we create an operating environment for politicians? I think it's important to think about what are the objectives in changing a public narrative. And for nature, I think it's elevating the issue relative to other issues on the agenda. You have the advantage of people are witnessing nature in their day-to-day lives all around them. And the older you are, the more memories you have of an Australian environment that was less destroyed than it is today, and many nostalgic memories of camping trips and experiences in nature. And Australians tend to associate their Australian identity with nature, with our creatures, with the dangerous snakes or sharks, or with the landscapes that we've grown up on and having summer holidays, etc. So there's a lot there that is right at your fingertips to connect to people. But it's about getting the message right, understanding where you want to take an audience. Then it's about having the right messengers to tell that story and connect to an audience, and then repetition. I feel like what's missing in the nature space is sufficient repetition of the crisis being there and all around us. So in my home in Melbourne, there are no Christmas beetles anymore. There was when I was growing up. There's no fairy wrens. There's a few kookaburras occasionally in the parklands near us, but there's very few other birds. So I may not notice that unless someone's told me, do you remember there used to be fairy wrens here? Do you remember there used to be Christmas beetles? People need to be reminded, and that was true in climate. Every time there's an extreme weather event, we remind people this is climate change. People do not connect the dots on their own. They don't notice what they don't see and what is not around them. So some of the tactics that we use at the Climate Council around elevating the climate issue, we established something called the Climate Media Centre, which is like a PR hub for the climate. So that generates 20,000 media items a year. It's not supporting the Climate Council's spokespeople, that's supporting small organisations, individuals, a really diverse range of messengers that can take the story to different audiences that we're trying to persuade. So that might be farmers, doctors, solar installers, it's vets, it's a whole raft of different people that can speak to a different audience. And I think what the nature movement could benefit from is having a diversity of spokespeople that are just being relentlessly put out into the media, and having a whole range of those sorts of tactics. Unless we're changing the communications environment, we're not creating the sort of impetus that will require politicians to change. And they're not feeling the pressure that they're feeling from other areas. We need to elevate nature as an issue relative to other ones. Often there's sort of a discussion about has climate kind of cannibalised the space for nature in the media? I think that's totally false. That assumes that there's a finite amount of environmental interest that's really small. I think that's totally untrue. Our job is to expand that space constantly, and that's what we've done with climate. I think nature can do that too.
Thank you very much. Sheryl, just wondering if you can tell us about the role of policy in ensuring access, engagement, leadership and decision-making for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the context of your work inside the department and beyond.
Thank you. I just want to start off with saying that over the last 6 months leading up to Saturday's referendum, it has been an extremely stressful and emotional time for us Aboriginal people. And I just want to remind folks that the vote on Saturday was whether or not to enshrine a voice in the Constitution. It wasn't a vote on whether or not to support Aboriginal people and outcomes for our land and water in our policies. And so if we can keep that in mind, it's really important that anything that we do for water and country management, policies actually do play a crucial role in ensuring that we do have access, engagement and leadership and decision making in that space. So for me, in the work that I do in access and engagement with and ownership of water for First Nations people, the main thing for me is really to see how we can actually access that water. So we need to have policies that are equitable and that they give that equity to access to water resources for our mob. And so that includes producing legal frameworks that recognise traditional land and water management practices. So for you as private landowners, have a think about how that might work in your space and how we might be able to support local mobs to come in and do some traditional knowledge and cultural activities upon your property if that's appropriate. Our policies need to acknowledge and respect the cultural significance of water for us mob. This involves engaging with us to learn about our cultural practices related to water and incorporating that knowledge into water management strategies. You heard me talk about leadership and decision making. It's really important that it's nothing for us without us. And so I put that into our policies when I'm working within government. We shouldn't be making decisions on behalf of Aboriginal people unless they've been a part of the table, part of that shared decision making and designing and considering what it means for them as individual First Nation groups or clans or holistically across the nation or a collection of mob. We need to support leadership building and empowerment. There's a lot of colonial legislation and other activities and policies that are put in place in this country, and it doesn't equate to any of the way that we do business from a cultural perspective. So ensuring that there is capacity building for us to understand what it means to work within the legislation and policy, or how you might want to do it in your conservation space, is really critical as well. Some of that's, one of the other things is around economic development. We've been disenfranchised from our lands and waters for over 200 years. How can we actually support our communities to get back and do the things that we want to do from a cultural perspective? And cultural for me is not just a pure cultural outcome, it also embraces environmental, social, spiritual and economic opportunities. Then we've got environmental conservation and sustainability. So these should emphasise our environmental conservation and sustainable use of water and land. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The last thing I would like to say is around monitoring and accountability. So we should establish mechanisms for monitoring the implementation of these initiatives, and not just assume that because we started at one point and we wanted to go from A to B, that B actually achieved what we thought we were going to achieve. And please, if you are engaging with First Nations mob, close the feedback loop. Often we come out and we get spoken to around our cultural beliefs, the way that we do things. It goes off and gets produced in a policy, and no one ever comes back to communities or for those that they sought the knowledge from and saying, here's what we've done with this. Is there anything that we can do better? Is there anything, any other opportunities that have arisen? Are there any lessons learned? We really valued your input that you gave to us, because we were able to match up our Western perspective with our cultural perspective. So these are all the things that I'm thinking about when I'm looking at the policy and programs that we need to implement on behalf of the government, on behalf of you as Australians as well. And so again, I just want to reiterate. Oh, sorry, that's a tautology again, and reiterate. I'm a grammar geek, that's really bad. Sorry. We should really, again, be developing in consultation with our communities, respecting their rights, their cultures and traditional knowledge to create sustainable and equitable water management practices. Thank you.
So Sheryl, I was wondering, would you have any, what you would describe as examples of good policy at the moment that has led to access, management, ownership of water?
Well, yes. Well, look, I have to be frank and say it depends on the politicians of the day on how much support as government people we get. But as an APS officer, I'm apolitical, and I always strive to get better outcomes for First Nations, as I said in my introduction. So we're looking at the Aboriginal Water Entitlement Program now. It was introduced in 2018 for funding for $40 million for water entitlements across the Murray-Darling Basin. David, close your ears. It has been very frustrating for mob for the last 5 years because it hasn't actually been implemented. But one of the things that I have initiated really strongly in the last 6 months since taking over this new branch to deliver on that program is really making sure that we're going out and consulting and listening to First Nations mob across the basin, and so hosting events where mobs can come together to give us their views, vent their frustration, totally reasonable frustration, and work with mob to determine how we go forward with this program. And so there are a series of things that we're doing now. We're having another whole of basin gathering in November to go to the next step for a purchasing framework, looking at the governance arrangements that want to be established by mob, with the ultimate aim of completely getting government hands off this program and handing it over to First Nations for their management, their decision making, their ownership, their purpose, objectives for a long-term sustainable outcome that goes beyond a normal government time frame of a 3-year program on that cycle. So I think it's really important that by capturing those priority reform principles that are under the Closing the Gap around shared decision making, use of data, empowering community-controlled organisations, and more importantly, changing the way government does business. So for us to relinquish control from a government perspective over to mob for that decision making is going to be a massive step, and I think that's a really good policy outcome.
Thanks very much, Sheryl. Now, we've just got a few more minutes before we open it up to the Q&A. I'm wanting to ask David a question about a private members bill that I think you've recently developed and introduced that really, I think, is directed towards creating a duty of care, probably in the climate, with specific reference to climate change, but looking towards the next generation, intergenerational equity and fairness. I'm wondering if you could tell us how that relates, your thinking behind that, and how it could relate to, if you like, the nature crisis.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that we're dealing with now is the consequence of short-term decision-making over a long period of time. And we saw the former Environment Minister, Susan Ley, argue that the government didn't have a duty of care to young people when it comes to climate, which I remember, at the time I wasn't a politician, but I was furious to have a government arguing that they didn't have a duty of care. And they won that appeal. Last week before, Minister Plibersek was arguing that she and the government shouldn't have to take into account coal mine emissions because on their own they're inconsequential. And it's just this ridiculous short-term thinking. And so in the ruling against Anjali Sharma and a bunch of young people who took the government to court, the court said that this is really a decision for the parliament, not the judiciary. And so we're very much just trying to plug that gap and say, okay, well, let's legislate that politicians and decision makers have to consider young people and future generations. Like if we're not doing that, what's the point? What's the point of politicians if they're not looking after young people? So this duty of care bill really is focused on climate. There's obviously the push for a climate trigger in EPBC laws. That's not looking very good, to be frank, from what we're hearing. This is another angle saying let's change the way we make decisions. It's climate, but I'm hopeful that we start to make a bit of a dent in the way that decisions are made. We should be thinking further than the next election.
And when you say it's climate, I mean, my very brief reading, you have also talked generally about environment, duty of care to the next generation for the environment as a whole. Would you see it in your thinking as relevant to, as I say, the nature crisis that we have?
Well, if you look at the pressure that climate change is already putting on ecosystems, it's relevant. And we've seen in Montana in the US, young people successfully argue in court that they have the right to inherit a healthy environment. So we've really tried to make this targeted at climate. It's tight. It's, I think, defensible. It's going to a Senate committee, so it's open for submissions if you want to back it in. But really, we have to have the broader conversation about decision making in there. We've got to be thinking about young people and future generations. What sort of legacy are we leaving people?
I think I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm sure that's the case for a lot of people here. And you know, policy seems to me to have such a relevant role to play there when we're thinking about next generations, because without frameworks, I think the evidence is out there that decision makers make decisions really based on things that are of present concern to them. Getting people to make decisions for the next generation is pretty tough. We're biased towards the present. So, yep, that's really good. Now, I need to move to the Q&A. I'm wondering if there are any questions for our panel. All I can tell you is that this thing up here says minus 57 seconds. Okay. Oh, Anne, I'm sorry, I need you to come back. Okay, so a question for the panel. Policy is largely dictated by the short-term election cycle, but a longer-term vision is required to drive systemic change for nature. How can we set and promote such a vision? So, Amanda, what do you reckon?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as David said, it's I think environment has been plagued by this short-termism. I think there is a really big opportunity now with the reform of the environmental laws, the EPBC Act. There is a range of ways in which that reform will proceed. We are very hopeful that climate will be included, but as David said, it doesn't look good at this point. I think that there needs to be a lot of unity between those arguing for environmental change and action on climate change. They're hand in glove. There could be much more collaboration across the board, and I think the EPBC Act is a place to do that. And there are discussions also about whether that law, how it enables clean projects, which is a really different way of thinking about these laws, rather than just preventing or making sure projects are not as bad as they might be, thinking about how do we facilitate renewable energy and other things that we know we need for this transition, but making sure that we start doing things in a much better way and learn the lessons of the past, whether that's from how we engage First Nations people, whether that's engaging communities, and whether that's thinking about which areas of the country we're using for whether it's transmission infrastructure or renewable energy and other things. So the coming together of environmental groups, climate groups, First Nations groups around those questions can set us up, I think, with the government being reasonably open to that conversation, if not to the fossil fuel question, to have a much better set of laws that will underpin how we go forward, because the laws are fundamentally broken. There's been 740 fossil fuel projects approved under that law. There's been nearly 2,000 species threatened. So they're clearly not working. Can we come together to push the government really hard to make them work a lot better?
Great, thank you. So the next question, and thank you very much, Mike Roach, for that question. Next question from Jennifer Barwick. The push for renewables and growth of new mineral mining will consume huge tracts of nature. How do we not repeat the same mistakes, and how does nature get better valued in this trade-off system? That seems a perfect question for you, Ken.
Sure. Well, I don't know if it's perfect. Let's have a go. So we do need more transparency about the environmental impacts of projects, right? And we need something, a mechanism, an incentive, that encourages project proponents to commit to nature-positive projects. Now, some of these projects you might think that's inconceivable, but I don't think we should give up. I think the idea of nature-positive mining, first time I heard that, I thought, well, you're kidding, right? But actually, the more I've looked into it, the more it occurs to me that nature-positive mining could well be possible. But what's required is that a commitment is made, that the environmental impact is evaluated on a regular basis, that there's full public transparency about the impact of the mining operation on the environment, there's follow-up, blah, blah, and so on and so on and so on, and there are penalties if it doesn't work. It's not impossible to set this sort of system up. If you think about it, it's actually the sort of system that has been set up in the carbon offsets market. Now, the carbon offsets market has been subject of some controversy for understandable reasons, but nevertheless, the carbon offsets market, I am very confident, is going to be a substantial driver of economic activity in Australia and is ultimately going to produce better environmental outcomes. We need to extend that thinking based on strong commitments, based on rigorous assessment, based on transparent reporting. We need to extend that to things like renewable energy projects. Why not? I mean, it's a crazy idea that we would be pursuing renewable energy projects that do environmental damage. It's nuts. But there are ways of ensuring that it doesn't happen.
Thank you very much. Now, Donna Hazel's asking, what are the key actions needed from government to remove and/or overcome the financial incentives that motivate the destruction of nature for development? I'm wondering, David, if you've got any thoughts on that question.
The starting point is environmental laws that actually protect the environment. That has to be the start. And again, I think there's so much work to do to push Minister Plibersek and the government on this. We heard last week that they are not going to do the public consultations that they said they were going to do, and they're going to do sort of higher level peak body conversations about this. It's so critical that we get this nature reform laws right. I think another one is really holding the private sector to account. This is to their commitments. I think more transparency around climate and nature-related risks is critical. You know, the big four banks have all signed up for the Paris Agreement, and since then they've gone on to fund a whole bunch of fossil fuel expansion projects, and some of them continue to do that, to shell out money to projects that we know are putting at risk all the people and places that we love. So I think there are a number of things that the government can do, and I think increasingly we're seeing a lot of appetite from big institutional investors who are looking at the risks. And you look at Europe, where they are far ahead of us, and we're going to start missing out on some of this capital. I think we probably already are, because it's more transparent. They can actually calculate risk. So we've got to get up to speed with things like TCFD, TNFD, and really make that a priority.
I was wondering, would you have anything to add on that point, Ken?
I agree with everything that David has said. I guess what I'd add is, and it goes back to the earlier question to Amanda, which has to do with permanence. You know, I mean, God help us, right? When Australia eventually settled, I thought anyway, settled on an emissions trading scheme for addressing the climate emergency, I thought, well, this is great, you know. We've done our job, game over. And what do you know, with a change of government, 20 years of work, the world's best piece of legislation for addressing climate change is just scrapped, bang, gone like that. It's a salutary lesson. But in asking myself what could have been done in order to have avoided that outcome, well, there are many things, presumably, but one is it's a damn shame that the system didn't actually have a whole set of private contracts in place that, had they been scrapped, would have created political havoc for the wreckers. And it seems to me that the lesson for that, for nature, is that we have to do what we can now, and I know there's a session later this afternoon on this very topic, and I would encourage all of you to attend it and participate in the role that markets can play in facilitating nature repair, because if we can get those market mechanisms developed now and we can get those contracts written, then repealing a system is going to be much more politically challenging for a future government. And there's a hell of a lot of potential there. And going to David's point about the importance of the TNFD, look, there are economic actors all over the place who are vitally interested in knowing what it is that businesses are doing with respect to their impacts on nature. It's not just people like us who care about the environment because it's a vocation for us. Consumers care. They want to know how the products that they consume are being produced and what the impact of that production process is on nature. Workers want to know, because today workers can choose whether they work for an environmentally friendly business or whether they work for one that pollutes the environment. Investors certainly want to know, and David's right, and I certainly get told this regularly. There are huge pools of money out there, particularly offshore, but also in Australia, that are interested in preferencing nature-positive activities over the same activities, essentially the same, activities producing the same products, but which are nature-negative. They want to have the opportunity to preference the nature-positive over the nature-negative. Banks do want to know, if only because they understand that there's less risk associated with projects or investments that have have less exposure to climate risk, but also to nature risk. And insurers really do want to know, and so there's economic actors throughout the economy who, if given the information, have the power to change business behaviour. All they need is the information.
Great, well, thanks. Now, I think this is a question probably for Amanda and Sheryl. Louise Arkles is wondering, how important is advocacy and frontline activism in generating policy improvements? Amanda.
Well, I said earlier that it's about the operating environment for politicians. So I think it's critical. We need a huge amount of public agitation so that politicians have, I often use the word surround sound, that as a politician is moving through the community, they're hearing it from all sides. They're hearing it in a business forum. They're hearing it when they do a speech. They're hearing it, the questions being asked by a journalist. So that requires a huge amount of effort to be getting that politician to be surrounded by that noise. So I think the starting point is, yes, it's really important. How do we do it? It's challenging, but it has to be that relentless effort of communications, strategic communications work to get these issues in front of people.
Thank you very much. And also, Sheryl, I was wondering if I could add in another question for you. Yes, and then I've got one specifically for you.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's imperative that there is advocacy out there, especially in the First Nations space. For us, we probably need to move more from a lobbyist perspective to an advocacy rein, because I think in the political arena, it's getting tied to our politicians' ears for us to keep banging our heads up against the wall. So advocacy is really important. I think we need to have a think about, going on to the previous question on getting past this 3-year cycle, is also about how can we get those longer term outcomes. How do we future-proof the work that we need to achieve to get better outcomes for First Nations people? And if that is advocating to our Teals, our independents, our Greens that are traditionally supportive of environmental outcomes and conservation, more so than the two political parties that are normally in power. I think that's really imperative. I just was also remiss in one of my previous answers. I'm going to take the opportunity now. One of the things that we're doing as governments across Australia is we've established the Committee on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Water Interests, and they are up to 12 independent Aboriginal men and women who provide advice to the governments on how to do better things in the water space for mob. Renee, put your hand up. I'm putting you on the spot. Stand up. There he is. Renee is our chair of the committee. They have decided as a committee to be bold and brave, to come back to governments to do better outcomes, not just towing the party political line on whoever's in business at the moment. And that is another way to future-proof outcomes for mob in the water space.
Okay, so some advice is being sought from you on balancing meaningful engagement with First Nations people with the risk of over-consultation from disparate parts of government, and whether you've got any advice on that point.
Oh my God, thank you. There is so much engagement wanting to go on out there. There's a lot of goodwill from governments to do that, but we find that we go out to the same old again, and it is really tiring in that space. We need to consult with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to get perspective if we're going to work with and not for. No, that's the wrong thing away. If we're going to do things together, we do need to have a yarn with mob. How do we do it in such an effective way that we're not turning up 1 week from this department, the next week from the next department, the next week from a different jurisdiction? So we have looked to put some engagement planning together in terms of at least having visibility at a departmental level and like departments, whether it's state jurisdiction or federal government, on what types of things we're going out to engage on and when we're going out, where we can combine those types of conversations we do. But equally, we don't want to spend hours upon hours each day with the same people again on that. So it is challenging, but we are working towards that a bit better. And also in the engagement, it's not just about sending something out by the web to get feedback from a written advice. It really is having that conversation and listening. We need to turn our ears on a bit more and turn the mouth off a bit.
Thanks, Sheryl. I've got one more question and then a general question for all of you to wrap up. I think, we're here, we're talking about policy. That means we're talking about politicians. You're a politician, David. So the question is, are we dropping the ball in getting government to invest directly in talking as much as we are about market-based instruments? I mean, obviously they're both important, but I want to know whether you think we're dropping the ball at all.
I think we absolutely are. And I think one of the things we've seen over the last year is because Labor is better on climate the environment, very low bar from Scott Morrison, we haven't necessarily kept the pressure on them. And I think we're getting to the point now where we're realising that they have to step up. The talk of, spending more than we ever have before just doesn't cut it. We know how much we need to spend to actually ensure that there aren't any new extinctions. And it was really worrying that the first thing that the government proposes is a market mechanism that really didn't have much support. It was very unclear where the demand was going to come from and clearly looked like a pipeline of offset credits. Government has to step up. This is important. The market stuff can be, the icing on the cake, but there's a lot of work to do to actually invest in nature, in monitoring, in projects, in our national parks, in management. It's so underfunded across the country. Even here in the ACT, people love to talk about the bush capital. Almost half of the ACT is protected. The government's not spending much. They can't even tell me how much they spend on threatened species. It has to be more of a priority. So I think absolutely the government needs to put more money towards it. And you sit in there and you hear some of the amounts of money that get thrown around when it comes to basically every other portfolio, infrastructure, health, defence. And then when it comes to the environment, 10, 20 mil seems like a lot of money, but we're a massive continent. So absolutely, I think they have to step up with some cold, hard cash.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the final question for our panel, if you can be fairly brief, but what we'd love to know, we might start with Amanda and work across, is what message do you have for the wide network of private land conservationists here, and what can they do to help?
A couple of things. As we've said, the environmental laws that are under review right now are really critical. I think it's a great opportunity to create focus around what needs to be done on Australia's environment, and there's a huge opportunity there. In terms of the communications, I think that often there's sort of a laundry list of problems and a laundry list of solutions. I think that we can get better at putting the relentless sort of campaign for these are the challenges for nature, but also some specific solutions that the community can connect with, making it relevant to people's daily life. And I think the environmental laws are that opportunity right now.
I'd like to just say I have an extreme gratitude towards you for your efforts in preserving our natural heritage. I think your work is crucial in supporting and sustaining our environmental outcomes for not only our generation but future generations, and I think that's extremely important. I would encourage you to continue to engage at your local level with your property partners, with your local businesses, with your local government, residents, schools, businesses, and of course First Nations people. Let's get more mob out there supporting you and what you need to do or endeavour to do on your property. I think what it is really having that focus of a sense of stewardship for the future would be the most important thing. So that would be my main point. So thank you. Thank you for your efforts.
Well, I would just say that following several hundred years of failure, we now find ourselves at a rather unique point in human history, and I think it's a time that's full of opportunity, really, and I'm very optimistic that in the next couple of years, people like you in this room will be able to work with others, including governments, but also those in business and in financial markets, to produce a transformation in environmental policy and outcomes. I really do believe that.
Firstly, thank you so much for the work that you're all doing in your various areas. There's something really admirable about the Aussie way of doing things, sort of low-key, under the radar, and we're such an incredibly wealthy country. I know there's lots of people putting money into land conservation. I think we've got to get better at telling those stories, of actually saying, I'm putting my money where my mouth is and doing these things, protecting land, and really trying to make that something that people aspire to do, is to invest in the future. We're facing enormous challenges, but I can't think of anything more enlivening and more meaningful than being part of turning this around and beginning to restore our incredible biodiversity on this mega-diverse continent and handing it on to the next generation and saying, we were part of turning the ship around, it's on to you. The future can be exciting.
Okay, well, that was great. It was really great. Thank you so much. Just want to, I suppose, summarise or give a few top-level thoughts or words about what I heard anyway, which is, number one, each of you does seem to be optimistic about the fact that we can do something. That we are at some point where nature seems to be being better, the crisis seems to be better understood. We've got climate change having gone before us. We can learn about those things. Things are happening. But we do have a long way to go. And look, every single person in this room would know that. I know that. But you're saying if we're thinking about policy, then a number of things are relevant. How the general public sees things and thinks about things and what pressure they bring to bear on their politicians is critical, because when we're thinking about policy, politicians are critical. They're kind of in the middle of it, and there's work to do there. That's what you're saying. There really is work to do there. We need to keep the pressure up, and we need persistence, we need resilience, but we should be expecting more from our laws, and we should be expecting more from our public resourcing. I think the other thing I heard is, in terms of the targets and the things that we set, they need to be relatable. They need to be easy enough for people to be able to buy into them, make them work and use them. So they're all the things that we can do. And it means there is absolutely a job for ALCA, we know that. And as I said at the very beginning, ambitious policy and regulation is a key pillar of our strategic plan. So I want, hopefully you'll all join me to thank our fantastic panel for really saying to us, we can be optimistic, but there's a lot of work to do and we've got to keep the pressure up. So thank you very much.
All right, it's almost coffee time, everyone. If you want to talk directly to policy makers, then please engage with the parliamentary submission. It's going to be on the ALCA table that's out in the foyer area. You can make additions to what's going to be submitted or suggestions. You can actually add your words to the bottom of it to make that even stronger submission that's going to go to Minister Plibersek. There's also, during the break, a special networking meetup in the Discovery Zone, which is one of the areas out there for future leaders. So if you think you fall into that category, definitely head over to the Discovery Zone. There's heaps more, but in order to get through it, let's meet back at 10:50 today. Session A will be here, the other sessions will be upstairs, and I'll see you in the coffee line.